The edge of reality. How swords were actually used in medieval wars, not like Hollywood. The truth behind the steel. A historical narrative. Forget the epic clanging, the acrobatic leaps, and the endless blade-on-blade duels you've seen in movies and video games. The real story of the medieval sword is one of brutal practicality, complex technique, and a horrifying efficiency that Hollywood simply cannot capture. It is a story not of gleaming heroes, but of heavily armored, exhausted men fighting a dance of death where a single missed step meant a crushed bone, not a clean slice. This is the untold history of the medieval sword. An indispensable tool, yes, but often a backup weapon on the battlefields of Europe, reserved for the specialized kill, the desperate measure, and the final, brutal moments of a fight. The myth of the sword as primary weapon. In popular culture, the sword is the defining weapon of the medieval knight. The reality is far different. From the 13th to the 15th centuries, the heart of the High and Late Middle Ages, the true primary weapons of the battlefield were those that could counter the era's greatest invention, plate armor. The poleaxe and halberd. These were the undisputed kings of the melee. They combined an axe head for cleaving, a spike for thrusting through mail or helmet vents, and a hammer or fluke for smashing plate armor. They offered reach and devastating kinetic energy. The lance. On horseback, the lance was a literal human-sized bullet, its entire purpose being to generate enough force to shatter the enemy formation and punch through armor. The mace, hammer, and flail. The terrifying practicality of a warhammer was its ability to transmit concussive force through plate steel. A well-placed blow would leave the target's limb or skull perfectly intact, but the bone underneath would be utterly pulverized, a wound that guaranteed death or lifelong crippling. So, where did the sword fit in? It was the sidearm of the professional killer. The sword's true role. The battlefield scalpel. The sword was essential, but it was generally drawn only when one of three scenarios occurred. The polearm was lost. If a soldier's pike or halberd was broken, dropped, or entangled, he would draw his sword as his next line of defense. The combatants were grappling. In the horrifying crush of close-quarters combat, where soldiers were fighting cheek to jowl, the long reach of a polearm was a hindrance. This was the moment for the sword, often used for a rapid, focused kill. The target was vested or unarmored. If the enemy was a light skirmisher, archer, or, crucially, had been knocked down and was vulnerable at the joints. The sword was the weapon of personal commitment. Its portability, balance, and reliability meant it was always there. Unlike a bow, it never ran out of ammunition. Unlike a lance, it never broke on impact. It was the weapon a knight could take to mass, sleep beside, and use to govern his lands. It was the symbol of his authority, but on the battlefield, it was his last, most personal, and most versatile tool. Technique 1. The murder stroke, the ultimate contradiction. The most shocking reality for a modern audience is the technique known as the Mordhau, or murder stroke. Imagine an elite knight clad in full Gothic or Milanese plate armor, a steel shell weighing about 50 to 60 pounds, designed to deflect cutting edges. Hitting him with the edge of a sword was largely pointless. It would glance off the curved surfaces like striking a tank with a baseball bat. To counter this, the soldier would often flip the sword around and grip it by the blade, which was manageable thanks to the gloves of the armor or the dullness of the blade near the crossguard. He would then use the pommel, the heavy ball on the handle, or the crossguard, the bars protecting the hand, as a makeshift hammer. The pommel strike, delivering a focused blunt force trauma to the unprotected face, eye slits, cheek gaps, or the smaller, weaker joints. The metal pommel concentrates the weight of the blow, functioning exactly like a hammer. The crossguard hook, used to hook behind the elbow or knee joint and wrench the knight off balance, or even to hook behind the visor to rip the helmet off the head. The murder stroke is the definitive proof that the purpose of the medieval greatsword was often not to cut, but to crush. It was an armored, weighted stick first and a knife second. Technique 2. Half-swording, the blade as a lever. When two fully armored opponents were locked in a close, desperate struggle, another technique came into play: half-swording, Halsschword. The fighter would choke up on the blade, grabbing the middle of the sword with their non-dominant hand, again protected by gauntlets. This instantly turned the large, unwieldy two-handed sword into a short, powerful spear. This close quarters grip offered several advantages. Point accuracy. It allowed the fighter to control the blade with incredible precision, guiding the tip into the tiny vulnerabilities of the armor: the armpits, the groin, the inside of the elbow, or the crucial eye slits. Leverage and power. It leveraged the body's core strength for a concentrated thrust, allowing the fighter to muscle the tip past a piece of plate or through a link of mail. Wrestling and grappling. The shorter, stiffer weapon could be used to parry at close range, push the enemy away, or, most importantly, lock up the enemy's weapon arm while the fighter moved to a grapple, the true goal of much of armored combat.
The duel wasn't just swordplay, it was wrestling with an edge. Many of the surviving manuals on sword combat, such as those by Fiore de Liberi and Joachim Meyer, dedicate enormous portions of their instruction to ringen, or wrestling. The sword was just a specialized tool for winning the grapple, allowing the fighter to create an opening for the final gruesome thrust. The true sound of war. Hollywood loves the clang of sword steel hitting sword steel. It sounds epic. It is also highly inefficient and a waste of energy. In reality, the battle was characterized by the chilling sounds of heavy impact and piercing force. The thud and crunch of the hammer, the terrifying smash of a poleaxe or warhammer striking a breastplate, followed by the muffled crunch of ribs and sternum collapsing underneath. The whistle and tear of the arrow or bolt, the omnipresent threat of arrows and crossbow bolts that dominated the landscape, not the sword. The ring of the point. When two swords did meet, it was a momentary ring, followed by the immediate attempt to bind the opponent's blade, slip past the parry, and find the vulnerable opening. A good swordsman never wanted to block with the flat of his blade. He wanted to deflect, displace, or bind. Continuous ringing parries are a fantasy. The real fight was often over in seconds, a brutal, exhausting flurry of calculated moves designed to inflict a disabling, catastrophic injury. The psychological edge of the symbol. Despite its secondary combat role, the sword held immense cultural power. It was the badge of the freeman. Only a free man was typically permitted to carry a sword. Peasants and serfs, even when armed, used agricultural tools repurposed for war, scythes or billhooks. The sword symbolized status, law, and liberty. A religious object. Many swords were given names, blessed by priests, and even had religious relics placed in their pommels. It was the instrument by which a knight swore his fealty and by which he defended the Christian world. The final act. Even as a secondary weapon, the sword was almost always the instrument of the final, ritualistic, or personal kill. When an armored knight was knocked down, the men with swords would move in to deliver the coup de grace, the merciful or brutal thrust to the throat or armpit, ending the fight decisively. The sword, therefore, was not merely a weapon, it was a vessel of identity that defined the very nature of a medieval warrior, even as the brutal realities of war demanded more crushing, piercing tools. Story outline: The Master of the Thrust. This story will follow the life of a historical figure or a composite character who must unlearn the romantic notion of the sword and embrace its brutal, technical reality.
Part 1. The Courtly Lie. Setting, 1380s, Burgundy, France. Character introduction. Sir Calin de Fer, a young, third-born son of a minor noble, is trained in the traditional, flowery fecht book style of fencing, the kind popular for tournaments and courtly displays. He believes the sword is a weapon of honor and clean cuts. The master's shadow. Calin is assigned to a renowned but disgraced veteran warrior, Maître Thomas, a man known for his brutal efficiency, not his chivalry. Thomas, who served in the 100 Years' War, scoffs at Calin's training. The training revelation. Thomas immediately shifts Calin's training to half-swording and murder strokes. Calin struggles, finding the techniques clumsy and dishonorable. Thomas forces Calin to practice hitting wooden dummies with the pommel, teaching him that concussion, not cutting, is the goal against plate armor. The tournament. Calin is forced to fight in a local, unarmored tournament using only the edge. He wins, but Thomas is unimpressed, telling him, "You just wasted energy. That only proved you can kill a peasant. A knight would laugh at your flourish." Part 2. The Crucible of War. Setting, 1396, the Crusade of Nicopolis. The deployment. Calin and Thomas join the vast, ill-fated Crusader army heading east to fight the Ottoman Turks. This provides the ideal contrast, European heavy armor versus lighter, faster, but highly disciplined Ottoman troops. Initial shock. Calin is thrust into a skirmish. He draws his sword and attempts a classic movie-style parry, only to have his opponent's war axe smash through his guard, bruising his arm through the mail. He realizes the sword is too light to reliably block a heavy weapon. He only survives when Thomas steps in and uses his poleaxe to end the threat. The sword's true use. During a night raid on the camp, Calin finds himself in a tent fight, a space too confined for a spear or polearm. Forced to draw his sword, he instinctively uses half-swording to thrust into the joints of an armored Turkish soldier, finally understanding the technique's purpose, a spear that can be concealed on your hip. The Battle of Nicopolis, the disastrous historical battle. The French knights charge prematurely. Calin witnesses the devastating efficiency of the Ottoman forces. He sees his fellow knights, relying on cutting with their greatswords, fall to the Turks' lighter, faster attacks and the sheer number of enemy spearmen. The final stand. Calin and Thomas are dismounted and trapped. Calin's polearm is broken. He draws his sword. He uses the murder stroke, smashing the pommel of the advancing janissary's helmet, staggering the opponent before driving the sword tip into the eye slit, a kill of brutal, calculated efficiency. Part 3. The Legacy of the Real. Setting, post-Crusade, Italy. The aftermath. Calin and Thomas are among the few survivors, ransomed or released. They return west, fundamentally changed. The new role. They are hired as condottieri or mercenaries in Italy, where the science of war is the most advanced and armored combat is the norm. Calin's reputation is now not for his grace, but for his cold, surgical brutality. He is known as the master of the thrust. The final test, the duel of justice. Calin is called upon to fight a trial by combat, a formal, armored duel. His opponent is a classicist, an older knight who relies on honorable, edge-on-edge fighting. The climax. Calin, fully armored, does not waste energy on cutting. He grapples with his opponent, using the sword's crossguard as a lever to pin his opponent's arm. Then he performs a swift, powerful thrust, a punto riverso, through the chest, targeting the gap at the armpit. The fight lasts less than a minute. The Courtly Lie. Setting, 1380s, Burgundy, France. The Gilded Cage of Chivalry. The air in the Burgundian court was thick with the scent of roasted venison, expensive perfume, and the sweet, intoxicating lie of chivalry. Young Kalin de Fer, barely 20 years old and possessing the lean, elegant build of a noble who had never missed a meal, lived entirely within that lie. He was the third son of a minor barony, his inheritance being meager lands and an oversized sense of duty fueled by romantic poetry and the illustrated Vechtbuchs, the fight manuals used for display, not defense. Kalin's greatsword, a meticulously polished Italian model, was a masterpiece of the cut. Its edge was kept razor-sharp, ready for the flowing, arcing strokes taught by the courtly fencing masters. He practiced the Oberhau, overhead cut, and the Zwerchhau, cross cut, with the practiced grace of a dancer. In his mind, a true duel was a beautiful, ringing symphony of steel, ending with a clean, honorable defeat. His current assignment was a formal humiliation. His elder brother, responsible for Kalin's martial education, had decided Kalin needed seasoning. Kalin was sent not to a renowned master of the tournament, but to a disgraced veteran known only as Maitre Thomas. Thomas was a brute. He was built like a stone foundation, his face scarred not by graceful duels, but by practical, ugly strikes. He wore plain, patched gambeson over his hardened leather, and his weapons were meticulously maintained, but utterly devoid of decoration. He carried not an elegant longsword, but a frighteningly practical heavy warhammer and a short, ugly blade, a clear sign that he prioritized utility over status. "You are Sir Kalin," Thomas grunted, not a question, but a statement issued over a whetstone he was running across the beak of his warhammer. "I am," I replied, straightening my silk tunic. "I am ready to improve my technique. I am particularly interested in the proper use of the descending cut, the flow before the final strike." Thomas paused, letting the whetstone drop into a bucket of oil with a heavy clunk. He slowly lifted his gaze to Kalin. A long, devastating silence followed. "You have been taught to dance," Thomas said, his voice gravelly. "I teach men how to kill things that bite back. Against an armored man, your descending cut is merely a distraction before he shatters your leg." Kalin felt sickened. "That is barbaric. It is not honorable." Thomas spat in the mud. "Honor does not save your life when a man in full plate wants to collect your ransom. A man who is crushed inside his own steel shell stops moving. A man who has been cut might only be angry." Training revelation, the brutal geometry. Thomas relentlessly forced Kalin to unlearn his flowery techniques. The next lessons were even less glamorous. He tied ropes around Kalin's midsection and had him wear heavy lead weights inside his tunic, simulating the fatigue of actual armor. Then Thomas introduced half-swording, Haubschwert. "Grab the blade, boy. Get control of the point." Kalin, wearing only thin gloves, protested. "But the edge?" "The edges of a greatsword are often left blunter near the crossguard for this very reason," Thomas roared, forcing Kalin's hand onto the middle of the blade. "If you are in a grapple, or if your target is standing right in front of you, you do not need reach, you need leverage and precision." Kalin was forced to practice thrusting the short, heavy point into tiny openings cut into a wooden dummy, the space under the armpit, the gap where the tacit thigh armor met the breastplate, the crucial visor slit. It was exhausting, repetitive, and geometrically complex. The focus was not on broad, sweeping movements, but on the tiny, precise alignment of the tip, driven by the leverage of both hands working together. The sword was now a short spear, a tool used not to fend, but to puncture. "You see, no edge work," Thomas pointed out, watching Kalin strain to drive the point through a small hole. "The cut is for unarmored fools, or for when the enemy has already fallen and you need to slice the straps of his helmet to make him a prisoner. The thrust is for ending the fight." The tournament and the laugh. A local lord sponsored a small, unarmored tournament, a chance for the young nobles to impress the ladies with their finesse. Kalen, dressed in lighter gear, still felt the lessons of Tomas weighing on him. He fought his first two opponents with his courtly style. The cuts were clean, the footwork elegant, and he won easily. He felt the familiar surge of pride and the approving whispers of the onlookers. He was a champion of the courtly style. In the final bout, his opponent was a larger, slower knight who relied on brute strength. Kalen, with a graceful dodge, delivered a perfect shielhau, a slicing strike that wrapped around the man's neck and forced his surrender. Kalen walked back to his post, elated. "Did you see, maître? The finesse, the flow." Tomas was leaning against a post, his arms crossed, watching the crowd. "You just wasted 40 seconds of energy," he said, turning back to Kalen. "Your opponent was not in armor. Your fancy cut did not even draw blood. It only stunned him. If he had been wearing a visor, you would have just bounced your sword harmlessly off his steel shell. You won a game. You did not win a war." Tomas stepped closer, his scarred face grim. "They call this sport. They call this honorable. They do not fight men who look back at them with hate in their eyes and whose armor can deflect a cannonball. You proved you can kill a peasant. You have not proved you can kill a knight. And that, Sir Kalen, is the only thing that matters." Kalen looked down at his beautiful chipped sword. The blade, once a source of pride, now felt like a deceitful lie. He realized his whole identity, his status, his honor, his perceived skill, was built on a style of fighting that was utterly obsolete against the greatest threat of his age, the man encased in steel.
The Crucible of War. Setting, 1396, the Crusade of Nicopolis. The deployment, promises and pole arms. The decision was swift, fueled by Kalen's shame and Tomas's grim pragmatism. When news arrived of the great pan-European crusade against the Ottoman Turks, Kalen's brother saw it as a chance for the young knight to earn glory. Kalen saw it as a chance to test Tomas's unforgiving lessons. As they marched east with the massive, arrogant army, a glittering host of French, Hungarian, and Burgundian nobles, Kalen observed the true hierarchy of weapons. His fellow knights carried their elegant greatswords, but they rode with the lance fixed in the rest and wore the heavy war-hammer or mace hanging from their belts. The men-at-arms, the backbone of the force, were armed with the poleaxe and the halberd. The sword, Kalen realized, was the weapon of personal commitment, a backup, not the tool for breaking the enemy line. Mater Tomas's maxim, "Your sword is for when the fight comes to you. Your poleaxe is for when you must bring the fight to the enemy. It is a sword with 100 pounds of impact." Initial shock, the axe versus the edge. The first serious skirmish occurred near the Serbian border. The Crusader vanguard, overconfident, encountered a detachment of Bosnian light cavalry serving the Ottomans. Kalen found himself dismounted, facing a quick, agile cavalryman who had exchanged his spear for a formidable heavy war axe. The Bosnian was less armored, favoring speed. Instinct took over. Kalen drew his sword and attempted the elegant ox guard and a flowery parry that his courtmaster had taught him. He aimed for a clean cut to the man's exposed leg. The Bosnian cavalryman simply ignored the threat to his lower body, raising his axe. He blocked Kalen's blade not with his axe head, but with the thick wooden shaft of the handle, displacing Kalen's cut with minimal effort. Before Kalen could recover, the axe head swung down, not cutting, but aimed for the junction of Kalen's spalder and breastplate. Smash! The impact was devastating. Kalen's armor held, but the kinetic energy was transferred directly to his shoulder.
A white-hot pain shot down his arm, and his sword clattered uselessly in the mud. He tasted dust and blood. The cut had failed. The blunt force had succeeded. The Bosnian raised the axe for the finishing blow. A terrifying whoosh and a sickening crack saved Kalin. Tomas, rushing forward, had used his long poleaxe to hook the Bosnian's ankle, yanking him backward. As the Bosnian fell, Tomas reversed the grip and brought the poleaxe's hammerhead down on the Bosnian's face with a sickening finality. "You used a toothpick to block a boulder," Tomas roared, dragging Kalin up. "When they have a heavy weapon, you get off the line, or you use your long weapon to keep them away. You do not try to match steel with steel. The sword is not a shield."
The sword's true use. The confined space kill. The lesson in the failure of the cut was quickly followed by a brutal lesson in the necessity of the thrust. Days later, the Crusaders camped carelessly. A small group of Ottoman Akinci, raiders, successfully infiltrated the camp under the cover of darkness, intent on sowing chaos and capturing high-value targets. Kalin awoke to the sounds of screaming and tearing canvas. His tent, large enough for pleasant sleep, was a claustrophobic death trap when two fully armored Akinci burst in. He instinctively reached for his poleaxe, but the pole poles and the close proximity of the enemy made the long weapon useless. He would only hit canvas or Tomas. He drew his sword. The space was so tight that he had to choke up on the weapon, his left hand gripping the middle of the blade, half-swording. The first raider lunged, trying to stab Kalin in the side with a wickedly curved dagger. Kalin used the crossguard of his sword to parry the dagger downward. Then, with the short, levered grip, he drove the tip upward. He didn't aim for the plate. He aimed for the narrow, crucial gap where the tasset met the breastplate. The short, powerful thrust, fueled by the leverage of his two-handed grip on the choked-up blade, punched through the lesser armor. The Akinci gasped, the tip having found a vital organ. The man collapsed, gurgling. The second raider paused, shocked by the sudden, precise kill. Kalin seized the opportunity. Still using the short grip, he didn't stab. He used the sword's crossguard to hook the raider's elbow. He shoved his shoulder into the raider's chest, applying overwhelming pressure. This was Ringen, grappling with the sword as a painful, bladed lever. The raider lost his balance and fell, his helmet visor popping open upon impact with the ground. Kalin dropped his sword, yanked his own dagger, and plunged it into the exposed gap. It was over in seconds. There was no elegant clanging, no flowing cuts, only grunts, the tearing of fabric, and the sickening sound of metal punching into flesh. "It was so close, Mitre," Kalin stammered, pulling the sword from the first man's body. "I couldn't use the full length." Tomas nodded grimly, already checking the perimeter. "The sword is the best weapon for a hallway, a ditch, or a tent. It is the best when you are close enough to smell his breath. It is the weapon for the final, precise death. Never forget that." The Battle of Nicopolis, the ultimate betrayal. The great clash came at Nicopolis. The battle was a disaster, largely due to the French commander's insane, glorious, yet utterly reckless charge. Kalin and Tomas watched the carnage unfold. The French knights, eager for glory, charged the Ottoman main line. The Ottoman janissaries, disciplined and prepared, deployed dense blocks of spearmen and stakes. Kalin watched in horror as his fellow nobles, still believing in the romance of the cut, drew their great swords after their lances broke. They tried to hack their way through the formations. The heavy, sweeping cuts were ineffective against the density of the Ottoman formation and useless against the armored few. Every cut wasted energy and left the attacker open.
The Ottomans responded with brutal, organized efficiency. They focused their attention on the horses, bringing the massive knights crashing to the ground. Kalin and Tomas, dismounted by a coordinated volley of arrows, found themselves in the terrifying, crushing melee, the putzfleck, the chaotic press of bodies. Kalin's poleaxe was shattered by a chain of Turkish blows. He drew his longsword. He was now alone, facing a fully armored Ottoman cavalry commander who had discarded his saber for a deadly heavy mace. The commander swung the mace, a weapon designed for crushing. Kalin parried with his sword, but the mace's spiked head, though deflected, struck his crossguard, forcing his grip open and causing his hand to scream in pain. Kalin knew he couldn't deflect another blow. He couldn't cut through the commander's armor. He remembered Tomas's lessons. If you cannot cut him, crush him. If you cannot crush him, pierce him. The commander raised the mace for the killing blow. Kalin made a split-second decision that defied everything he had been taught at court. He didn't block with the blade. He flipped the sword. He gripped the blade, the heavy pommel now his primary weapon. As the mace swung down, Kalin ducked inside the attack, used the force to push the mace away, and brought the pommel up in a short, powerful, hammer-like arc. The murder stroke, ugly, ignoble, and terrifyingly final. Thwack! The metal pommel struck the Ottoman commander's visor, concentrating the blow on the thin metal slit meant for vision. The commander stumbled backward, the rattling impact rattling his brain. Before he could fall, Kalin reversed his grip one last time, releasing the blade and letting the longsword turn back into a thrusting weapon. He found the commander's armpit, where the heavy plate was thinnest, and drove the point deep. Kalin stood over the fallen body, gasping, his mind reeling. He had not won the fight with honor or grace or the flowing beauty of the cut. He had won it with a hammer, a lever, and a specialized knife.
The army was shattered. The promise of glory had become a massacre. Kalin and Tomas were captured, prisoners of the pragmatic Turks. But Kalin was alive, and his elegant sword now felt not like a lie, but a brutal, versatile truth.
The legacy of the real. Setting: post-Crusade, Italy. The ransomed and the condottieri. Kalin and Tomas survived the slaughter at Nicopolis, but only through the brutal necessity of their potential value. They were ransomed back to their families, ruined financially, but possessing an invaluable education in war. Kalin's faith in glory was gone, replaced by the grim knowledge of survival. They did not return to the frivolous courts of Burgundy. Instead, they traveled to Italy, the birthplace of advanced Renaissance warfare and the home of the condottieri, the mercenary captains who treated war as a calculated science, not a chivalric endeavor. This was where plate armor reached its apex and where the techniques for killing armored men were most refined. Kalin, now known quietly as a survivor of the Great Disaster, quickly established a new reputation. He was no longer known for his flowing cuts, but for his cold, surgical efficiency. He became the master of the thrust. In Italy, the fight masters were not concerned with tournament points. They were concerned with leverage and geometry. Kalin's training under Tomas finally made complete, terrifying sense. He learned to fight his longsword not as a cutting weapon, but as a rigid steel rule, whose primary function was to measure and exploit gaps. The point over the edge. When fighting the incredibly dense Milanese and Venetian armor, Kalin used his longsword like a giant, two-handed estoc, a specialized thrusting sword. The entire structure of the blade, its strong spine and narrow tip, was designed to pierce through the weaker mail sections or to punch through the padding and plate at the joints. He focused his footwork entirely on creating the straightest line between his point and his opponent's vitals. The grapple is the win. Kalen became an expert at binding the opponent's blade, locking their sword with his own, not to block a blow, but to achieve the grapple. Once blades were bound, the advantage went to the one who could apply the most sudden leverage, allowing him to throw his opponent or transition swiftly to the half-sword grip for the definitive thrust. Kalen's new maxim, "The cut is a prayer, the thrust is an order." The final test, the duel of justice. Years passed. Kalen, a successful mercenary captain, was called upon for a trial by combat, a formal duel under oath to settle a legal dispute between two rival Venetian families. The conditions were strict: full-plate armor, long swords, and no interference.
Kalen's opponent was a respected older conducero named Bartolomeo, a man steeped in the outdated but aesthetically pleasing martial traditions. Bartolomeo believed in honor, clean strikes, and the traditional sweep of the longsword. He opened the duel with a grand, sweeping Wechselhau, changing cut, a powerful move designed to drive Kalen back. Kalen did not block the cut with his blade. Instead, he performed a subtle deflection with his crossguard, using the moment the cut bounced off his armor to surge forward. He didn't waste the energy of a full parry. He used the momentum of Bartolomeo's own cut to close the distance. They were now locked chest to chest. Bartolomeo, expecting an exchange of cuts, was caught off guard. His heavy cut had left him overextended. Kalen acted instantly. The bind and lock. Kalen used the crossguard of his sword to hook Bartolomeo's right elbow, pinning the opponent's powerful sword arm. The grapple. Kalen shoved his weight forward, applying full pressure to Bartolomeo's chest plate, a pure act of wrestling. Bartolomeo, destabilized and unable to use his primary weapon, struggled futilely. The final thrust. Keeping the elbow locked with the crossguard, Kalen used his left hand to stabilize the blade near the center and performed the punto riverso, reverse thrust. It was a short, blindingly fast upward movement. He aimed not at the plate, but at the narrow, unarmored space of the armpit, a vulnerability exposed by the upward pressure of the grapple. The fight lasted less than 50 seconds. Bartolomeo stiffened, the thin, piercing blade having slipped past the pauldron and into his chest. He collapsed, defeated not by superior strength or fancy footwork, but by superior geometry and knowledge of human anatomy. Kalen stood over the fallen knight, his armor unscuffed, his sword tip wet with blood. He had not drawn a drop of his own blood. It was a victory of cold, calculated survival over romantic flair. The forging of a new reality. After the duel, Tomas was the first to approach Kalen. "They will say it was dishonorable. They will say you should have exchanged cuts." Kalen, exhausted but calm, slowly wiped the blade of his sword, inspecting the tip. "They will say whatever makes them feel safer. They will never admit that the most effective way to kill a man is often the ugliest." He returned to his armory. He took his magnificent but flawed Burgundian greatsword and had it stripped down. He ordered the smith to reforge the blade. The new sword was slightly thicker, stiffer, and the profile was narrower, specifically weighted and balanced for the thrust, not the cut. The point was needle-sharp, the ultimate weapon for piercing. The edges were still sharp, but they were secondary. He engraved a single word on the crossguard, not a flowery name, but a simple instruction: punto, point. Cailin spent the rest of his life not fighting for glory, but teaching the next generation of men-at-arms. His manual, unlike the courtly guides, was short, brutal, and focused entirely on the three truths of the sword against armor. The thrust is paramount. Always seek the joint, the armpit, the groin, or the face. The cut is for the unarmored. The grapple is the opening. Use the sword to bind, hook, and lever to win the wrestling match, which then exposes the vital points. The pommel is the hammer. When all else fails, use the murder stroke to crush the foe inside his own steel shell. His final words on the matter, passed down to his students, summarized his bloody education. Your sword is a magnificent tool, but it is not a toy. It is a hammer, a lever, and a scalpel. Respect its truth, or the battle will kill you with its lie. Forget the clanging of the movies. Listen for the crunch of the bone, the tear of the leather, and the soft shush of the point. That is the true sound of war. His legacy ensured that in the real wars of the Middle Ages, the sword was finally understood for what it was, the ultimate pragmatic weapon of the professional killer. The Hard School of War, the Testament of Maître Thomas. The Fog of Crécy. Setting, 1346, northern France. Before he was the scarred and cynical Maître Thomas, he was just Thomas, a simple English man-at-arms, a commoner given a chance to fight for King Edward III. His sword, a simple arming sword, was worn but sharp. Like Cailin, he had believed in the power of the clean cut, the strength of his arm, and the honor of the fight. His illusions died, drowned in the mud and blood of the Battle of Crécy. The French, in their thousands, charged forward in waves of magnificent, disorganized chivalry. Thomas was positioned with the English archers and dismounted men-at-arms, the core of the English defense. The battle was a terrifying education in what truly dominated the medieval field, the missile weapon and the pike wall. As the first exhausted French knights reached the English lines, having stumbled through the mud and endured the hail of longbow arrows, Thomas was pushed into the front rank. A massive French knight, his horse downed by an arrow, lumbered toward Thomas, sword drawn. Thomas raised his arming sword, aiming for a cut to the helmet. Whump! The knight, already spent, did not try to cut back. He simply lowered his large kite-shaped shield and slammed the boss of the shield into Thomas's chest. The impact knocked the wind from Thomas's lungs and sent him staggering backward. I tried to cut through his armor, Cailin, Thomas would later recount to his young pupil, his eyes distant. I fought the steel. He fought the man underneath. He wanted to break me, not kill me clean. Thomas survived that moment only because his pikeman comrade stepped up and drove his long, rigid pike through the knight's visor, a direct, cold thrust that bypassed the entire issue of armor. The sword in that moment was useless for anything except perhaps a clumsy parry. The butcher's trade, Poitiers, and the ransom game. A decade later, Thomas was at the Battle of Poitiers, 1356. By now, he carried a war hammer on his belt, a concession to the increasing prevalence of plate armor. He had learned that the sword was for opportunity, the hammer was for necessity. Poitiers was famous for the capture of the French king John II. This battle drove home the economic reality of the sword. In the heat of the melee, Thomas found himself facing a noble whose horse had been killed. The noble fought desperately with his sword, but Thomas, using his warhammer, focused only on destroying the armor. He avoided the sword, instead aiming short, brutal swings at the knight's helmet and gauntlets. Crunch, clank. The sound was hideous, the hammerhead crushing the steel and the hand beneath it. The knight dropped his sword, whimpering, his hand already a mess of shattered bones. Thomas did not kill him.
He used his dagger to saw off the straps holding the man's bassinet, helmet in place, exposing his neck. "Yield!" Tomas screamed, his own breath ragged. The knight yielded. Tomas, having disabled him with the hammer, then used his secondary weapon, the sword, to slice the leather straps of the armor, not to kill him, but to disarm him and bind him as a prisoner. The lesson of Poitiers. We did not want to kill the nobles, Kalin. We wanted their money. The sword was the tool for the final, precise disarming. The hammer was the tool for making him willing to surrender. The sword, in that context, was a tool of commerce.
The road warrior and the rise of precision. After the big battles, Tomas's life became one of bandit hunting, garrison duty, and mercenary work, the true day-to-day grind of medieval soldiering. It was here that his personal skill with the sword began to evolve, from clumsy defense to surgical offense. He learned the half-swording technique not from a formal master, but from fighting in the narrow confines of castle stairwells and muddy roads where a full swing was impossible. He realized the sword's immense power when used as a short thrusting weapon. The balance was perfect, the weight was manageable. In one notorious skirmish, Tomas and his comrades were ambushed in a deep, narrow gorge. His poleaxe was entangled, and his hammer was too slow. He pulled his longsword, choked up on the blade, and used the pommel like a club, knocking one brigand into the ditch. Then he used the stiff, short point of the half-sword to thrust precisely through the joints of two more. It was ugly, close, and brutal. He never forgot the precision. The sword was the perfect short weapon for the fully armored man, or for the man fighting in a confined space. It was the only weapon you could transition to seamlessly from a full polearm or shield defense. The Testament of Tomas. When Tomas met the young, flowery Kalin de Fer, he saw himself years ago, a man blinded by the romance of what a sword should be. His entire purpose was to strip Kalin of that self-destructive notion. His methods were harsh because the lessons were paid for in blood and crippling injury. He taught Kalin the murder stroke because he had seen men cut apart uselessly when they should have been crushed. He taught the half-sword because he knew the reality of fighting in a press, a ditch, or a tent. "They teach you to fence in court, Kalin," Tomas concluded one evening, running his thumb over the blunted section of his crossguard. "But we are not fencers. We are butchers and surgeons. Your sword must be capable of both. It must be capable of smashing a helmet and threading a needle into a man's chest. The man who forgets this dies, not elegantly, but choking on his own blood, while his killer laughs over the pile of his gold." This brutal, pragmatic education, learned through the chaos of Crécy, the economics of Poitiers, and the necessity of the soldier's daily grind, was the true inheritance Tomas passed to Kalin. It was the legacy of the real swordmaster. The evolution of brutality, the rise of the estoc. The logical conclusion, the unanswerable question. After years of fighting in Italy, Kalin de Fer and Maître Thomas were no longer just survivors. They were architects of practical battlefield doctrine. Their experience with the half-sword had taught them the definitive lesson. When facing the best armor, the sword's purpose was to be a levered, human-powered spike. The problem was that the classic longsword, while versatile, was a compromise. Its wide edge, necessary for cutting unarmored opponents, added weight and wind resistance to the thrust. It still required the cumbersome half-sword grip to achieve the necessary rigidity and precision for a vital thrust. The solution came from the armories of the late 15th century, a stark, elegant evolution born of pure necessity, the estoc, also known as the tuck or punto. The estoc was a sword that refused to cut. Design. The estoc was a long, incredibly stiff weapon, often 4 feet or more, but its blade was not wide and flat. It was thick, rigid, and typically possessed a diamond, square, or triangular cross-section. The lack of edges. Crucially, many estocs lacked sharpened edges entirely. They were effectively 4-foot-long iron spikes with a hilt. Since the cut was functionally useless against the latest plate armor, the edges were deemed redundant. The purpose. Its sole function was to act as a human-powered battering ram, concentrating the entire force of a two-handed lunge onto the narrowest possible point. It was designed to pierce mail, slip between plates, or, in the hands of a powerful man, potentially deform or even puncture thin sections of plate. Kalin first saw a company of Swiss mercenaries wielding these weapons. They moved with a terrifying economy of motion, their long, stiff points flashing not in sweeping arcs, but in direct, linear attacks. "They have removed the lie, Maître," Kalin murmured to Thomas as they observed the drilling. "They have accepted that the sword's purpose is to stab, nothing else." The new dance. Pushing and piercing. The estoc dictated an entirely different style of fighting, one focused on stance, leverage, and unstoppable momentum. Stance and guard. Fighters using the estoc often employed a deeper, more committed lunge, similar to a modern rapier fencer, to put their body weight directly behind the point. Their guard was often higher, holding the point level with the opponent's eyes or chest, maximizing the threat line. The thrust is continuous. Unlike the longsword, which required a complex transition to half-swording for precision, the estoc was always in thrusting mode. The goal was to overcome the armor's integrity through sustained pressure, shoving the point home once the tip found purchase, not just striking it. The duel of distance. Estoc fights became duels of distance and timing. The user needed to keep the enemy at bay with the point, frustrating any attempt to close for a grapple, while patiently seeking the small, vulnerable targets, the armpit, the gorget or throat armor, or the leg joints. Thomas, ever the pragmatist, found the estoc beautiful in its pure, single-minded purpose. No wasted motion, no wasted steel. It is the perfect tool for a professional who intends to kill men in a metal can.
The final lesson. The two sides of the duel. Kalin commissioned his own estoc. It was heavier than his previous longsword and entirely focused on the thrust. He realized that the evolution of the sword had split the battlefield into two distinct weapon philosophies. The crushers, poleaxes, hammers, for breaking the enemy's body and will through blunt force. The piercers, estocs, halberd spikes, for delivering precise, catastrophic injury through penetration. Kalin recognized that the Hollywood image of sword fighting, the edge-on-edge duels, was actually still happening, but only between two types of fighters. Light fighters, skirmishers, archers, and unarmored men who needed the cutting power of the edge. Duelists, men fighting in personal, unarmored combat, like the later rapier fights, where style and quick cuts mattered more than penetrating steel. But for the heavy soldier, the man who decided the outcome of a pitched battle, the sword had evolved beyond the cut. It was a spear strapped to the hip, a final, rigid answer to the question of armor. Legacy, the master's end. Kalin de Fer, the master of the thrust, lived into a wealthy old age, his mercenary company becoming one of the most respected and feared in Italy. He attributed his success not to bravery, but to physics. In his final years, he often sat polishing his estoc, a simple, sharp-pointed weapon that held no romantic secrets. One day, his young page, seeing the old knight clean the wickedly sharp point, asked him why he never fought with the sweeping cuts described in the old poems. Calin looked at the boy and gently tapped the thick spine of the estoc. "My boy," he said, his voice raspy, "those cuts are for the enemy's pride, but this," he gestured to the point, "this is for their heart." He had spent his life unlearning a beautiful lie and embracing a brutal, pragmatic truth. His story and the cold steel of the estoc stood as a silent, unromantic testament to how swords were actually used in medieval wars. The era of the elegant cut was over. The age of the brutal, geometric thrust had won.